The world is unraveling before our very eyes. Morality has become subjective, justice is bought and sold, and truth is buried under layers of noise and deception. These aren't just turbulent times, they're prophetic. The Prophet Muhammad warned us of this age, and now the signs he described are no longer distant or abstract. They are here, they are now, but these warnings were not left without guidance. Among the final signs, 5 individuals will rise, real men foretold in sacred tradition, whose emergence will mark the closing scenes of human history. Their arrival is not fantasy, it is the unfolding of destiny, and among them, one will emerge first, a man from Qatan whose leadership will shake the earth awake. This is not speculation. This is a revelation. The end has a structure, and that structure has begun. The world had changed, but not in the way generations before could have predicted. It was not a war of nations or a clash of civilizations. It was a slow erosion, like a mountain crumbling grain by grain, until all that remained was a silhouette of what once was. What was once sacred had become entertainment, parodied in films, mocked in memes, and treated as folklore rather than truth. Right and wrong no longer stood as moral opposites, but were filtered through feelings, political correctness, and algorithmic approval. The fabric of societies had torn in places that no one dared to stitch. Justice was no longer blind, it was bought. Morality had become a marketplace, and those with influence traded in values like currency. What was once vice was now celebrated in parades. What was once virtue was labeled oppressive. The compass of mankind had not just spun, it had shattered. And in this distortion, many believed it was simply a new era. The price of progress, the natural arc of history, but those who still held on to faith, those who remembered the words of the Prophet Muhammad, understood that this was no ordinary turbulence. These were the shadows before the storm. The Prophet had spoken of these days, not in vague riddles, but with precision. He warned of a time when liars would be believed and the truthful rejected, when leaders would be the worst among us, and when people would follow desires rather than revelation. And as the world plunged deeper into chaos, some began to reflect. These were not simply political shifts or social transformations. These were the footsteps of the hour, echoing through history. And they were getting louder, but the mercy of Allah never comes without warning. Embedded within the authentic traditions were not only the signs of destruction, but also the signs of hope. Men foretold by name and by deed, chosen to rise in the darkest hours of human civilization. Among them, 5 would stand out. Not prophets, for prophethood had been sealed, but divinely appointed men. Men whose emergence would mark turning points in the story of existence. They were not metaphors, not symbols. They were real. And the first among them would come from a land rich in prophetic history, a man from Qatan. His name would not be a surprise to those who study hadith. The Prophet said, "The hour will not come until a man from Qatan appears who will drive the people with his staff." That statement was preserved through centuries of scholars, memorized by hearts that trembled with awe, analyzed with reverence, and passed down through chains unbroken. And now, in the midst of the chaos, the world was about to witness it unfold. He would not come in a time of peace. His rise would coincide with global upheaval. The world would be searching for stability, yet drowning in propaganda. The oppressed would cry out, but no one would listen. Corruption would dominate leadership, and the Ummah would be fractured in spirit and unity. In such a setting, the man from Qatan would rise, not because he wanted power, but because the times demanded a leader molded not by politics, but by piety. He would not campaign, he would not flatter, he would not ask for allegiance. Yet people would follow, not due to charisma, but due to conviction. His leadership would be marked by clarity, decisiveness, and unwavering truth. The staff mentioned in the hadith is more than a physical stick. It symbolizes divine authority, the kind that Moses wielded not to dominate but to deliver, the kind of leadership that the world had long forgotten. He would not bow to the status quo. He would not serve the elite. He would be a man of God in a world that had forgotten God, and that alone would make him dangerous to the systems built on lies. He would shake the structures of corruption, not with weapons, but with justice. He would not plead with tyrants. He would challenge them. And in doing so, he would awaken the hearts of those who still longed for righteousness. Yemen, the land from which his lineage would descend, had always held a special place in Islam. The Prophet once said, "Faith is Yemeni and wisdom is Yemeni." The people of Yemen were the early adopters of Islam, known for their sincerity and strength of character. And now, from among their descendants, whether in the soil of Yemen or scattered across the globe, would arise a man carrying that prophetic legacy. But his path would not be smooth. The world that applauded superficiality would be offended by his depth. The regimes that thrived on manipulation would tremble at his honesty. He would not conform to the expectations of modern politics. He would stand as a mirror, reflecting the decay of a civilization back to itself. And those who feared the truth would fear him most. He would not be the Mahdi, but his role would be no less significant. Scholars debated, would he pave the way for the Mahdi? Would he rule alongside him? Would he appear before or after? What was clear was that he would be among the first of the five, a divine signal that the timeline had accelerated, that the final chapters were being written in real time, that what was once a distant prophecy was now current news. The world would not recognize him at first. The noise would try to drown him. But the believers, those whose hearts had not yet been corrupted, would see. They would feel it in his words, in his resolve, in his refusal to be bought or silenced. And like sparks seeking a flame, they would gather. Not out of blind loyalty, but out of instinct, a recognition of something sacred in an age of the profane. His leadership would not be gentle, for the world no longer responded to gentle truths. It would be firm, unwavering, and in his firmness, the Ummah would rediscover its spine. His rule would be a reminder of what leadership was meant to be, not about control, but about accountability to God. As his influence grew, so would the fear among those who built empires on deceit. He would be labeled a fanatic, a threat, a rebel. But to those who knew, he would be a revivalist, a restorer, a man who reminded the world that when morality collapses and guidance fades, Allah sends a man not to reform systems, but to reform souls. And just as the world began to stir under his command, another moment, long awaited, would come to pass. For prophecy does not pause, destiny does not delay. And as one figure rose, another would be prepared in secret. The Mahdi Ishani, the guided one, would soon be called. He would be a man like no other, a descendant of the Prophet. His name would echo the beloved name, Muhammad, son of Abdullah. His emergence would not be orchestrated by councils or governments, but by the will of Allah. One night, unknown to even himself, he would sleep a man and awaken the Mahdi. It would begin in Mecca. He would resist, attempting to flee the burden, but the righteous would find him and force his hand, not out of pressure, but from necessity. The pledge would be taken at the Kaaba, and the heavens would begin to respond. An army would be sent against him, marching from the lands of corruption, intending to crush the flame before it spread. But as they crossed the desert, the earth itself would rebel. It would open, swallowing the entire force, a divine sign that the Mahdi's leadership was no longer optional. It was destiny. And with that, the Ummah would feel the shift. The world would tremble, and the end would quicken. The pledge had been taken. The earth had swallowed the army sent to extinguish the flame. The believers had witnessed a sign they could not ignore, a divine confirmation that the Mahdi was not merely a man, but a fulfillment of prophecy. And so the Mahdi rose, not on the wings of power, but on the back of a promise written long before his time. With him, the Ummah began to breathe again. He was no ordinary leader. His face bore the light of sincerity, his gaze sharp with awareness, and his voice steady with conviction. He did not seek the throne, but it sought him. He did not raise his hand for allegiance, but the hearts of the righteous extended it to him. In a world choking on falsehood, his truth felt like the first clean breath after drowning. His rule began not with conquest, but with correction. The Ummah, fragmented by decades, if not centuries, of sectarianism, nationalism, and ideological confusion, slowly began to unite. He did not wield power like a tyrant, nor did he chase after global alliances or worldly validation. His strength was drawn from his adherence to the Qur'an and Sunnah, reviving practices that had been neglected and removing innovations that had crept like weeds into the garden of the faith. Under his leadership, the earth seemed to realign. Rain fell in due measure, crops flourished, and wealth flowed. The needy no longer begged. They were sought after to receive charity. The economic structures of greed collapsed, replaced by systems of equity rooted in divine justice. Those who once hoarded gold now found joy in giving. Those who once lived in fear now slept in peace. The Mahdi ruled not with fists, but with faith, and faith, when upheld with integrity, does not require force to be followed. But his era would not be confined to spiritual revival and social reform. There was yet another promise to fulfill, one written in the bones of history and echoed in the words of the prophet, the conquest of Constantinople, a city of ancient prestige, whose fate was prophesied not once but twice. The first conquest came at the hands of Sultan Mehmed II, fulfilling the glad tidings of the prophet that, verily, Constantinople will be conquered. What a wonderful leader will her leader be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. But another conquest, a second liberation, remained. With the Mahdi at the helm and the Ummah united behind him, the march toward Constantinople was not one of ambition, but one of destiny. It was not for land or power, but for the removal of darkness and the restoration of light. And this conquest, unlike any before it, would not be waged with weapons of iron, but with weapons of remembrance. The prophet described it in a way that stunned the hearts of scholars. They will say, Allahu Akbar, and one of its walls will fall. Then they will say, Allahu Akbar again, and another wall will fall. Then they will say, Allahu Akbar, and the city will be conquered. This was not hyperbole. It was a testimony to the power of the believer's tongue, to the weight of sincerity when aligned with divine decree. Takbir would become their battering ram, and the city's walls would yield, not to steel, but to submission before Allah. When they entered Constantinople, it would not be with arrogance or vengeance. It would be with humility, heads bowed in gratitude, hearts heavy with awe. They would cleanse the city of its impurities, not with destruction, but with renewal. And in that moment, the world would witness that true conquest is not about dominion, it is about restoration. But even as the banners of victory fluttered and the believers rejoiced, a new whisper spread among the ranks, one not of triumph, but of terror. From the east, a force was rising, not one of armies or empires, but of a singular man, one whose fitna would eclipse all others, the Antichrist. Al-Masih ad-Dajjal. The prophet warned of him more than any other trial. He did not merely inform, he emphasized, repeated, implored the Ummah to be on guard. Dajjal would not be an ordinary deceiver. His lies would not just confuse the simple-minded, they would challenge the faithful. His deception would be so convincing that even scholars would tremble. And now the time has come. He would emerge from a land in the east, possibly Khorasan, with a following so zealous, so deluded, that they would see him as divine. Among them, 70,000 from Isfahan, robed in garments of green, ready for war. But Dajjal's war would not be like others. His battlefield was not just land, but the soul. His weapon was not a sword, but an illusion. He would claim to be God, performing feats that to the untrained heart would seem like miracles. He would command the skies to rain and the earth to grow. He would travel swiftly across the globe, leaving devastation in his wake. He would hold what appeared to be paradise in one hand and hell in the other. But the prophet warned, his paradise is actually hell, and his hell is truly paradise. His physical traits would betray him to the faithful. He would be blind in one eye, described as bulging like a floating grape. Between his eyes, every believer, literate or not, would see the word kafir. This would be the mark not of ink, but of insight, a divine lens through which the believers could see the truth behind the mask. Medina and Mecca would remain untouched, protected by angels guarding their gates. But even Medina would tremble, shaking out its hypocrites, who would then join his ranks. It was a reminder that safety does not come from proximity to sacred places, but from sincerity in the heart. During this time, the Mahdi would rally the believers, not to despair, but to readiness. He would lead them in resilience, reminding them of the prophet's guidance, to flee from Dajjal, to avoid facing him directly, for his deceit could shake even the firmest hearts. But resistance would not be enough. A divine intervention was decreed, and it would come not through armies, but through a man been already known, already beloved, one whose name had been mentioned in reverence for centuries, Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, the son of Mary. The prophet described his return with startling clarity. He would descend near the white minaret in Damascus, adorned in robes of golden hue, his hands resting on the wings of two angels. His hair would drip as if he had just emerged from ablution. He would descend not to preach a new message, but to affirm the old. The Mahdi would offer him leadership in prayer, but Isa would gently decline, saying, "You are the leader of these people." In that gesture, history would pivot. The mission of prophethood would align with the final Ummah, a unity never before seen. And then Isa would set out, not to deliver sermons, but to confront the greatest deceiver the world had ever known. When Dajjal would see him, he would begin to dissolve, like salt melting in water. Such was the terror of truth upon falsehood. Isa would pursue him to the gate of Lud in present-day Palestine, where with a single blow the Antichrist would fall. His death would not simply end a man, it would end an era of illusion. The believers would rejoice, but it would not be a celebration of war. It would be a liberation of reality. The chains of deception would shatter, the fog of lies would lift, and the world, for the first time in generations, would see clearly. But their trials were not yet over. One more force remained, a force ancient and unstoppable, The release of Ya'juj and Ma'juj and Magog was imminent, and the earth would soon tremble again. They came like a plague, fast, feral, unrelenting. Their descent was not foretold with poetic flourish or symbolic mystery. It was plain, stark, and terrifying. Ya'juj and Ma'juj, the nations of chaos, were no myth. They were real, and their emergence shattered the brief tranquility that followed the death of the Dajjal. Isa ibn Maryam, peace be upon him, now stood not before a deceiver, but a force of destruction that numbers could not contain, weapons could not slow, and fortresses could not withstand. They poured forth from every high place, their numbers blotting the horizon, devouring every patch of green, draining every source of water, spreading ruin like fire across dry plains. The prophet had described them with a clarity that allowed no room for metaphor. During the era of Dhul Qarnayn, the mighty ruler who journeyed to the far corners of the earth, they had been sealed behind a great barrier, iron and copper fused by divine permission into a wall stronger than any man-made structure. They were not ordinary people. They were a people of violent instincts, destruction embedded into their nature like breath. And the wall that held them back was never meant to last forever. When Isa and the believers witnessed their release, it was not through divine revelation alone. It was through their eyes, their ears, their skin. They could see the earth tremble as these ancient tribes surged over the lands. They could hear the desperate cries of cities devoured whole in a single day. The believers, once victorious against deception, now found themselves helpless before destruction. Allah instructed Isa to retreat, to flee not as a coward, but as a servant obeying divine command. With the righteous, he ascended to the heights of Mount Tur, seeking refuge not behind walls, but in the folds of obedience. There, high above the earth that now screamed under the weight of the Ya'juj and Ma'juj, the believers prayed. They prayed with hollow stomachs and trembling voices as their supplies dwindled and the world below burned. They prayed for deliverance, knowing that it would not come by sword or strategy, but only through divine intervention. Days passed like years. Hunger clawed at their ribs. Thirst parched their tongues. The mountain air, once a shield, became thin with desperation. And still the armies of chaos roamed freely, their destruction unchecked, their violence unmatched. The believers, surrounded by prophets and filled with knowledge, now lived their greatest test, not of might, but of patience. And then in the stillness of a night when hope was nearly spent, Allah answered. He did not send thunder or fire. He sent a silent affliction. Nagaf, worms, invisible to the eye, entered the necks of the destroyers as they slept. No battle cry was heard. No army marched. And yet, by morning, the entire host of Ya'juj and Ma'juj lay dead. Millions of bodies sprawled across the land like scattered stones. Their silence was more terrifying than their uproar. But even in death, they brought devastation. Their corpses filled the earth, their stench unbearable. The believers pleaded again, not for victory, but for purification. Allah responded once more, sending birds unlike any seen before, great, massive creatures that lifted the corpses into the skies, removing them from the sight and smell of man. Then came a rain, pure and cleansing. It fell for days, washing the blood from the soil, the sorrow from the air, and the memory of ruin from the hearts of the survivors. When it stopped, the earth gleamed. It was as though it had been reborn. For a time, peace returned. Isa ibn Maryam led the world not as a prophet with a new message, but as a just ruler who enforced the final revelation. Under his guidance, the teachings of Muhammad were upheld in their purest form. There was no compulsion, no forceful conversion. Truth did not require coercion. It shone with clarity. Isa's presence was a seal upon all prior distortions. He broke the cross, not out of hatred, but to end the lie of divinity attributed to him. He killed the pig, not in malice, but to abolish the symbol of defiance against divine command. He abolished the jizya, for there would be no place left for religious ambiguity. The world had witnessed the last deception. Now only the truth remains. His rule ushered in a golden age. Rain fell in perfect measure. The soil yielded more than it was given. Animals lived without enmity. Wolves lay beside lambs, and children played with serpents as though they were toys. Wealth was distributed with such equity that people sought the poor to give charity, only to find none. No one lacked, no one feared, no one suffered. Mankind finally tasted what it meant to live in alignment with divine will. Isa lived humbly. He married, he had children, he ruled with compassion, but never abandoned justice. He laughed with the people, but never strayed from the path of righteousness. And when his time came, it did not come with violence or betrayal. He died a natural death, his soul taken with ease. And he was buried according to the traditions passed down beside the prophet Isa, completing the life once lifted prematurely. His mission now fulfilled became a memory engraved into the hearts of all who lived during that golden generation. But even gold loses its luster with time. With Isa's passing, the final chain began to loosen. The believers knew it. They could feel it deep in their bones, like the prelude to a storm. A divine tranquility had settled over the earth, but it was not permanent. It was a prelude to something else. The end was approaching. Then came the wind, not a storm of fury, but a breeze of mercy. It drifted from the direction of Yemen, soft as silk, fragrant like paradise. But it carried with it a purpose so profound it would leave the world hollow. This was no ordinary breeze. It was the caller of souls, sent by the command of Allah to perform one final act of divine separation. Every believer, every man, woman, or child who held even an atom's weight of faith would be touched by this breeze. It would seek them out, over seas and mountains, through cities and deserts, across crowded markets and empty homes. No wall could stop it. No distance could delay it. And when it reached them, they would not scream or cry. They would simply sleep, peacefully, gracefully, as though returning to the one who gave them breath. This was not death in the way we fear it. It was the gentle folding of a story, the closing of a sacred book. The righteous would not suffer. They would not see the world's final fall. For their test had ended, their deeds recorded, their place already prepared. And when the last of them had passed, the world grew cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. For now only the wicked remained. The earth, now stripped of its righteousness, groaned beneath the weight of its final generation. These were not people of confusion or ignorance. They were people who had rejected truth knowingly, who had seen the signs and turned away, who mocked what was sacred and fooled what was pure. Without faith to guide them, they behaved like beasts, no morality, no restraint, no dignity. Evil no longer needed to hide. It danced openly in the streets. And then, without warning, the horn was blown. The first blast tore through creation like a scream in a library. Mountains shattered, oceans boiled, skies tore apart like fabric. Every creature died, every sound ceased. The earth itself collapsed in on its sins, its structures, its histories. Silence fell, not peaceful but deafening, a silence that only the dead can hear. For a time known only to Allah, everything remained still. Not a leaf moved, not a voice rose, nothing stirred. Then came the second blast, and the dead rose. Bones reassembled, flesh returned, souls reunited with their bodies. The day had begun, the day for which every prophet warned, the day before which every sign had pointed, the day of judgment. They stood barefoot, naked, uncircumcised. All of humanity, from the first to the last, gathered on a single plane. The sun hovered overhead, so close that some drowned in their own sweat. The scrolls were opened, the witnesses called, and justice, long delayed, was finally dispensed. But among the crowd were those who had waited patiently, who had studied the signs, who had held firm through tribulations and fitan. They had remembered the 5 men, Al-Qatani, the Mahdi, Isa, and those who had stood at the gates of truth when the world had chosen lies. These were the ones who would rise not in fear, but in honor. Their faces would shine. Their records would be handed in their right hands. Their scales are heavy with good, and before them would stretch, not torment, but an eternity of light, of nearness to the one they loved, even when they had never seen him. And in that eternal abode, they would taste a peace this world had never known, a justice that would never again be broken, and a love that would never end. When the trumpet is blown a second time, time itself fractures. What was past becomes present, and what was hidden is now revealed. The earth, split and emptied, delivers its secrets. The skies, once vast and distant, fold back like scrolls. The mountains, symbols of permanence, scatter like dust. Every human being who ever lived, from Adam to the final soul taken by the fragrant wind, stands now upon the same plane, a plane so immense that all of creation fits upon it, yet there is no crowding. A space fashioned not by geography, but by divine command, a space made for the day that was promised. There is no place to run, no shade except the shade of Allah. This is Yawm al-Qiyamah, the day of standing, the day of reckoning. The sun hovers close, its heat unbearable, and people sweat in proportion to their deeds. Some sweat to their ankles, others to their knees, their waists, their necks. Some are submerged entirely, drowning in the weight of their own sins. On this day, the illusions of the world evaporate. Titles, wealth, power, reputation, none of it matters. Kings stand beside slaves. Generals beside the peasants they once ruled. Tyrants beside the orphans they oppressed. Everyone is stripped of pretension, of excuses, of escape. And then the scrolls descend. Each person receives their record. Some in their right hands, these are the blessed. Their faces radiant with relief, they lift their books high and say, "Here, read my record." Their joy is not arrogance, it is gratitude, the culmination of years lived in hope, in repentance, in sincerity. They are the ones who believed in the unseen, who followed the prophets, who recognized the signs, not just in the skies, but within their own souls. Others receive their books in their left hands, or worse, from behind their backs. Their eyes widen, their knees buckle. They whisper, "Woe to me, I wish I had never received this book." These are the ones who traded truth for convenience, who mocked revelation, who lived as though death would never reach them. The scales are set, deeds are weighed, hasqi, not in number but in sincerity and consequence. A single good deed done with pure intention outweighs mountains. A single cruel word, a single betrayal drags down a lifetime of apparent virtue. Nothing escapes, not a glance, not a sigh, not a heartbeat. Then come the witnesses. The earth speaks, bearing testimony of every step taken upon it. The limbs speak, hands, feet, eyes, tongues. They bear witness against the bodies they once served. You did this. You said that. You walked toward that sin. You turned away from that truth. Even time itself speaks. Every Friday, every Ramadan, every moment of sujud, every tear shed in prayer or sin, they rise now like living memories, undeniable in their truth. And among the people, the 5 men stand apart. Al-Qahtani, with the resolve of ancient Arabia and the scent of Yemeni soil, honored not for blood, but for his unwavering leadership in the time of unraveling. He came when the world had forgotten what justice looked like, and reminded them through courage, through strength, through divine conviction. The Mahdi, the guided one, radiant in humility, he who never sought leadership but bore it like a burden, he who unified the broken ummah, who filled the world with fairness after it had been choked by oppression. His rule was short, but it changed the course of history. Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, the Messiah, not as a symbol of division, but as the unifier of truth, the one who slew the Dajjal, not with armies, but with presence, who ruled with mercy, lived as a servant, and died as a man. Now he returns, not as ruler, but as witness. And then the martyrs, the unknown righteous, the quiet believers, those who never led armies or performed miracles, but who remained loyal when loyalty was costly. Their reward is not measured in this world's standards. Their rank with Allah is beyond imagination. Finally, the deceivers are exposed. The Dajjal, whose lies once seduced the world, now lays forgotten, cursed, his legacy shattered by truth. His followers, the hypocrites, the tyrants, those who sold their hereafter for moments of control, they cower, their regret unbearable. And then the bridge is extended over hell, as Sirat, thinner than a hair, sharper than a sword. Every soul must cross it. Below is the fire, roaring and alive, snapping at the heels of the unworthy. Some cross like lightning, others like the wind, others crawl, scraping and trembling, while some fall entirely, dragged by the weight of what they chose in life. On the other side lies paradise, its gates open wide, and beyond them, peace unlike anything the heart can grasp. Gardens beneath which rivers flow, palaces of light, reunion with loved ones, rejoicing with the prophets, and above all, the nearness of Allah, the Most High. There the believers will sit upon thrones, facing one another, smiling, recounting the days of hardship that now seem like dreams. No pain, no fatigue, no death, only eternity. And there Allah will speak directly to them. He will say, "Are you pleased?" And they will answer, "How can we not be pleased when you have forgiven us, honored us, and admitted us into Jannah?" But Allah will say, "I will give you more." Then He will unveil Himself to them, not in metaphor, not in vision, but in a way that no mind can imagine, no heart can prepare for. The believers will gaze upon the face of their Lord, and in that moment, they will forget it, all pain, all longing, all sorrow. It will be the reward beyond all rewards. This is the end of the story, but also its beginning. For those who remember the signs, who anchor their hearts in truth, who walk the path of the prophets, this world is just the prelude, a fleeting moment, a test. The end will come. It always does. But for the believer, the end is only the gateway to a peace that never ends, a justice that never fades, and a love that stretches into forever. So awaken, return, prepare. The signs are not fiction, the promise is not far, and Allah never breaks his word.